Hello, a warm welcome to our event, Russia's Great Power Role Between Ambition and Reality. My name is GERHARD MARCHL, and I'm responsible for European affairs at the Karl-Renner-Institut. This event is taking place in cooperation with the Society for Eurasian Studies. Many thanks to our partners, especially Alexander DUBOWY. Our event is live streamed on YouTube and on Facebook. Hopefully Facebook works as well, because we had some problems in the morning with Facebook. But I hope, as I said, that this works now. At any rate, the video will be available after the event too, on YouTube and hopefully also on Facebook. And you also have the opportunity to ask questions and make comments on YouTube and Facebook. One of my colleagues will send them to me, and I will try to bring the questions into the discussion. So what are we discussing today? Russia's great power ambitions. Russia has been dominating quite many headlines for weeks, months, and years. Let me bring some examples of the last 2 weeks. There was the incident a few days ago between a British warship and the Russian Coast Guard in the Black Sea. There was the question last week on the EU summit whether there should be an EU-Russia summit involving President Putin. This was a Macron-Merkel initiative that was rejected by some EU member states. There was the Geneva summit between Putin and Biden. And then again, we hear news on the case of Alexei Navalny. These are some examples of the last few weeks. Today, we want to focus on Russia's great power ambitions. Russia certainly is a great power, especially when we look at its military capabilities and its influence. But there is the impression that Russia and its President Vladimir Putin are eager to further increase Russia's power, especially in the post-Soviet space, but beyond too. And we all know that this great power ambitions conflicts with sovereignty claims and independence claims of other states. It also conflicts with NATO enlargement and other things. We will discuss the strategy behind Russia's moves and what can be expected from Russia in future. We will also focus on certain conflicts where Russia is involved in one way or another. Eastern Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan. We will discuss also the domestic conflict in Belarus, especially Russian influence there. And we will also shed light on the cooperative rivalry between Russia and Turkey in the Black Sea region. For all this, we have invited 3 distinguished speakers and real experts. A warm welcome to them. I have to announce that there was a last-minute change. Nona Michelice, whom we expected to be one of the panelists, had to cancel her participation because she got shot against COVID this morning and suffers from some side effects. Fortunately, we had the opportunity and good luck to find ARMINE SAHAKYAN. She's researcher at the Caucasus Institute in Yerevan in Armenia. Many thanks for jumping in on such a short notice. Welcome, ARMINE.
My pleasure, thank you.
We've also a very distinguished speaker from Moscow, ANDREY KORTUNOV. He's Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, RIAC. He's member of expert and supervisory committees and board of trustees of several Russian and international organizations, And I dare say that ANDREY KORTUNOV is a real insider when it comes to Russian foreign policy. Mr. KORTUNOV, ANDREY, warm welcome.
Sure.
And our third speaker, Alexander DUBOWY, co-organizer of today's event. He is a senior fellow at WeltTrends-Institut for International Politics. He is also Secretary General of the Society for Eurasian Studies, our cooperation partner for this event. He is a risk and policy analyst with a special focus on Eastern Europe, Russia, and the post-Soviet space. And Alexander has been, amongst others, teaching at the University of Vienna and the Austrian National Defense Academy. A warm welcome also to you, Alexander.
Thank you.
Thank you for the cooperation. So let's jump in. Let's go to our discussion. I would like to start with you, Mr. KORTUNOV. Russia plays an important role in the conflicts that exist in the post-Soviet space. I'd like to remind our audience of Eastern Ukraine and Crimea, the conflicts there, Georgia. Russia plays also an important role in the settlement, now peacekeeping in Nagorno-Karabakh. Transnistria is another example, the domestic conflict in Belarus. Of course, Russia's role differs a lot from conflict to conflict that I mentioned. It's peacekeeping in Nagorno-Karabakh, support to separatist entities in Eastern Ukraine, to bring two very different examples. What is clear is that Russia wants to be a great power, is a great power, and wants to be treated as a great power. And Mr. KORTUNOV, could you explain more to our audience the strategy that is pursued by the Kremlin? Is there a strategy? Who defines the strategy? And what can be expected from Russia in the future? Several questions. Mr. KORTUNOV, the floor is yours. Are you muted?
Yeah, that's the most popular meme right now. You're muted. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion. I think the topic is really interesting and somewhat controversial. And I'm glad that the Karl-Renner-Institut is going to have a discussion on this one. Let me start with saying that even in Russia itself, there is no consensus about whether the Kremlin has a strategy in the international affairs or not. Some people think that Putin is a strategist and he has a master plan, and they discuss what the ultimate goal of his activities is. Is it to restore the Soviet Union in a different form? Is it to turn Russia into a really global power which has influence even in remote parts of the world like Africa or Latin America? Is it an attempt to erode Western political institutions and to create additional problems for the United States and for its European partners? So there is one line of thinking which, in my opinion, has a lot with conspiracy thinking, but it is there. The other line is that no, Putin doesn't have a master plan. And he's a great tactician, but he's not a strategist. And basically what he's doing, he's looking for opportunities, be it in Syria or in Libya or in Venezuela, and he tries to exploit the opportunities which are emerging and which basically do not depend on the Russian position. Now, if you want my view on that, I'm somewhere in the middle. I don't think that Putin has a master plan, that he has a schedule, that this year he will handle Europe, next year he will focus primarily on Middle East, and later on he will switch to Southeast Asia. I don't think that there is a set of specific goals that the Russian leadership is pursuing. Clearly, a restoration of the Soviet Union is not a part of the design. But I think that it would be wrong to say that the Putin leadership is purely opportunistic, that they are just looking for opportunities and they jump at every opportunity that emerges on the global scene. I think that what the Russian leadership has is not a strategy as such, but rather a vision of the world and of the Russia's place in this world. And if you follow statements made by President Putin, by Minister Lavrov, or the Defense Minister Shoigu, and the other top politicians in Moscow, there is, I think, a rather consistent vision of the world, which we observe today, and also of the world which is likely to emerge in the nearest future. And this vision is not very optimistic. I think that the assumption is that we will have, and by we I mean the humankind, not just Russia, but the international community will have to go through a very difficult period. It will be a bumpy road with many conflicts, with the rise of nationalism and maybe isolationism on the part of major nations. It will be a period of international terrorism, arms race, also a period of decline, if not decay, of many international organizations and international legal norms. Again, there are discussions in the Russian political establishment about who is to blame. Of course, the West is the usual suspect, but some would say that it's not just about the West, it's about the accumulated impact of the economic development, this rampant globalization that we observed over the last 2 or 3 decades, technical progress which was mismanaged or poorly managed by international institutions. So there are many reasons why the world is likely to be a pretty rough place for years to come. But I think that the intention of President Putin and his team is to prepare Russia for this challenge, to make sure that Russia can cope with these challenges and these threats better than other nations. If Russia is in a position to use its comparative advantages, it can punch above its weight. And this is, I think, a part of the strategy, that Russia might be smaller than other actors in economic terms or in terms of its social cohesion, but it can definitely capitalize on its comparative advantages, such as its ability to mobilize resources and to make decisions fast, much faster than Western liberal democracies, or its ability to manage or to control, if you wish, the domestic public opinion and to ignore the political opposition on foreign policy issues, or to have a consistent foreign policy, unlike, for example, the United States, which has to relaunch its foreign policy with every change of the administration in the White House. One can argue that Russia can afford a certain moral relativism in foreign policy than other major players can hardly afford. Russia can make full use of personal diplomacy, especially when it deals with authoritarian and semi-authoritarian leaders, like the Chinese President Xi Jinping or Turkish President Erdogan, or even Indian Prime Minister Modi. So Russia has a number of comparative advantages which allows it to play in the top league when we see a lot of tensions and a lot of conflicts all around the world. So in a way, one can argue that Putin is lucky because his foreign policy style is very receptive to the international environment that Russia faces today. Of course, the big question is what happens when the Putin moment in global politics ends. What if we see a new cycle of globalization, a new cycle of global integration? What if major conflicts are resolved? If the arms race is contained? If we see prosperity and development rather than survival and security as major goals of nations in the emerging world order. My bet is that this new situation will definitely present serious challenges for the Russian political leadership, and this leadership, no matter who runs the place in the Kremlin, will have to readjust the Russian foreign policy, and most importantly, this leadership will have to diversify the instruments of the Russian international influence. Because today these instruments might still be quite efficient, but they're not in plenty. Russia has only a couple of instruments that it can use, and definitely the relative efficiency of these instruments might go down over time. So this is what I can perceive as midterm challenge for Russia as a great power in the international system. I think that unless Russia is ready to diversify, it might lose at least a part of its current international influence and stature. And this thesis can be illustrated by various conflict situations. For example, you take Syria. Russia can arguably win the war in Syria together with its partners like Turkey and Iran, but it can hardly win peace in Syria because if it gets down to the issue of the post-conflict reconstruction, of course, any Syrian leadership would look for partners who can render more economic and technological assistance. And I think to some extent the same can be applied to the territory of the former Soviet Union. Indeed, Russian peacekeepers in the South Caucasus might be an important element of preserving stability, but in the end of the day, countries of the region need economic development, not only security. And it's an open question whether Russia can be a major contributor to economic development of these nations. If there are changes in Belarus, again, my bet is that any new Belarusian leadership will try to extend its connections to the European Union without necessarily breaking its links to Moscow, but definitely the Russian influence in Belarus might go down. So there are challenges. My short answer to the question is that so far Russia remains a great power, and it has the luxury of playing in the top league of the global politics. But this ability can be challenged if the currency of power in this world will become different from what it is now. Thank you.
Thank you for your statement and just describing the comparative advantages of Russia and the challenges. Thank you very much. You briefly mentioned the peacekeepers in the South Caucasus, and this brings me to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And this brings me also to our second speaker, SAHAKYAN from the Karl-Renner-Institut in Yerevan. Russia's role in this conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh is a very special one. Russia is protecting power of Armenia, and at the same time it has good relations with Azerbaijan, and also sends weapons to both countries, sells weapons to both countries, and now Russia is a peacekeeping force. Mrs. SAHAKYAN, how do you see Russia's role in the conflict? And what would you say is Moscow's agenda? Is Russia, to put it bluntly, is Russia an honest broker in this conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Well, thank you for the question. In order to understand Russia's agenda, the conflict, and particularly in the South Caucasus region, we have to look at the specific interests that Russia has in regards to the both countries party to the conflict, Armenia and Azerbaijan. The interests are very different, but still they are very much interconnected. So if we look at Armenia, Armenia is a strategic partner for Russia, and it is a member of Russian-led structures like CSTO and Eurasian Economic Union. So it is very much economically and militarily connected to Russia. If we look militarily, Russia also has a military base in Armenia. I'm speaking of the military base in Gyumri, and Russia's military presence is also gradually growing to the southern part of Armenia. I'm speaking of Syunik, which is the region, the Armenian Mars bordering to the conflicting zone, Nagorno-Karabakh, and well, Azerbaijan. And also there are the Russian peacekeepers, which are present in Nagorno-Karabakh, and also the Armenian city of Goris in the region of Syunik. So Russia is largely present in Armenia, both militarily and economically. If we look at Azerbaijan, both countries, Azerbaijan and Russia, have mutual economic interests. And in terms of regimes, I mean, politically, they are much more alike than that of Armenia and Russia. I mean, if we look at what is happening in Armenia for the past 3 and 4 years, revolutions, demonstrations, frequent elections, street protests, over and over again, and understandably, this is not something that Russia understands as much as it understands the regime in Azerbaijan. And third, Azerbaijan is an oil-based economy, and economically it is very much independent from Russia as compared to, let's say, for instance, Armenia. Armenia's gas prices are also dictated and controlled by Russia. And also Azerbaijan is not a member of CSTO or the Eurasian Economic Union, which are both Russian-led structures. So Russia tries to keep both countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan, within its zone of influence, and it does, to answer your question, it can't be an honest broker, and it doesn't want to be and doesn't need to be an honest broker in this conflict, because Russia's priority in this region mostly is security, not values or honesty, but security. And instability is not beneficial for Russia, of course, but total peace and status quo is also not beneficial for Russia because it plays on the security card. If we, well, that would deprive Russia of maintaining its influence in the region if there was not Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. If we look back at the foreign policy choices made by Armenia and Azerbaijan during the past years, we can see that the security imperative, the need for having security in regards to this conflict, has largely influenced the choices, let's say, by Armenia in 2013, when suddenly President Sargsyan made a U-turn when we were about to sign an association agreement with the Eurasian, with the EU, and we didn't. It was a security imperative. Also, it should be fair to mention that in case of Armenia, there's also the gas prices tool that Russia uses to influence So to sum up, some instability, no peace and no war situation is rather on the agenda of Russia in this region, because thus it can help, it can maintain its influence in here. Speaking of the current situation, current status quo, Russia's influence is gradually diminishing, although there are peacekeepers on ground, but we have seen during the last war introduction of new players in the region, which has largely diminished Russia's presence in the region. I'm speaking of Turkey. So we will see what will happen in the upcoming 5 years, because the peacekeepers, as of now, based on the agreement, they are here for 5 years, and well, I think that situation will largely change and possibly change in the upcoming years. That would be the answer to your question. No, Russia is not an honest broker.
Thank you very much. So Russia isn't an honest broker in this conflict, and its role is diminishing. We'll come later to that there are new influential powers in this region, not new, but with more influence, such as Turkey. We'll come to talk later on this. Alexander, another interesting conflict that has been dominating the headlines in the last few months, since last summer actually, is the domestic conflict in Belarus with President Lukashenko suppressing the opposition in his country. How do you see Russia's role in this conflict? What can be expected from Russia? What would you say? What would Russia do if Lukashenko has to step down? There's also the question, why does Russia support a president who has lost the support of the majority of the population? Isn't Russia also losing hearts and soul in favor of the West, so to say? Isn't this a high price for his support, for Russia's support to Lukashenko?
Thank you, Gerhard. Yeah, quite a lot of questions. So let's start maybe this way. In the first place, the special role of Belarus for Russia of central strategic importance to Russia. It is far more crucial than any other post-Soviet country or region, including the annexed Crimea. So Belarus is, from the Russian point of view, the most important ally in terms of security policy. It's an outpost to the West and an important link to the Kaliningrad exclave. And against the background of the political crisis in Belarus, Moscow's minimum objective is to safeguard its security and economic interests and to prevent Belarus from being westernized. And the maximum goal would be a deeper integration within the framework of the Union state, especially in the security and defense policy area. For Belarus is already met policy terms. As for Lukashenko, Moscow will hold on to Lukashenko as long as it seems reasonable, but not at any price, and definitely not forever. From the Russian perspective, Lukashenko seems to be quite an unwelcome, but nevertheless still the ideal option to date. So despite all the difficulties and Lukashenko's openly anti-Russian rhetoric in recent years, so Lukashenko's dictatorial style of government is an important obstacle in the rapprochement between Belarus and the West. So any democratically legitimated president would be a welcome dialogue partner for the West. And for this reason alone, problematic from the Russian point of view. And furthermore, it should be noted that Russia will hardly accept a in any case. So, of course, there is no reason to assume that Belarus will reorient itself westwards, at least at present point. However, from Moscow's perspective, I think that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's meetings with the Western politicians give every reason to be concerned. And I think that from the beginning of these protests in Belarus in August 2020, Moscow seemed to be assuming three basic scenarios. So the first one, in the event of Lukashenko's failure, Moscow would drop him and support a controlled transfer of power to an alternative candidate who is acceptable to Kremlin. So, for example, Valery Tsepkalo. Second scenario, in the event of an uncontrolled collapse of Lukashenko's regime, Moscow would probably go for an ultimate military intervention. A military intervention at Lukashenko's request and legally disguised as a humanitarian intervention based on the Kosovo precedent. This scenario is quite unlikely, but nevertheless not impossible. And the third scenario, and this would be actually the status quo scenario. Lukashenko, who managed to sit out the protests, will be more or less gently persuaded to accept a deeper integration within the framework of the Union state and gradually hands over power to a successor who is acceptable to Moscow. And talking about losing or winning heart and souls of the Belarusian population, just two short points. I think that winning hearts and souls are not really a category in which Moscow thinks it's geopolitics. So, after all, public opinion can be influenced if desired. At least this seems to be a widespread opinion of a substantial part of Russian foreign policy elites. So because of that, for the Russian leadership, quite different issues seem to be of importance. And these issues include, but are certainly not limited to, geopolitical considerations, questions of national security, expectations of the Russian society, at least to some extent, and the potential consequences for Russian domestic politics. And finally, Moscow's imperial complexes, which have not been overcome yet, are also likely to play a significant role. And please, Dr. Kortunov, just correct me if I'm wrong in this point. And the second point, it must be stressed out that a pro-Western orientation of the Republic of Belarus at the expense of relations to the Russian Federation is extremely unlikely to happen, at least in the short to medium term anyway. So the dependence of Belarus on Russia in economic and energy policy terms is very complex. And Moscow is the creditor of over 70% of Minsk's foreign debt, and Belarusian state enterprises are dependent on the access to the Russian markets. Even the mere desire to break away from the Union state or the Eurasian Economic Union would inevitably lead to Russian economic sanctions and the exclusion of the Republic of Belarus from the Russian market. And in order to reduce this obvious dependency of Belarus on Russia, investments from the European Union and from the United States would be required in the billions. And the latter is unlikely to happen anytime soon, not least because of the pandemic and its negative economic implications.
Thank you, Alexander, for this analysis of the Russian position on Belarus and the scenarios for the future. Thanks a lot. Mr. Kortunov, I'd like to bring you again into the discussion because there's also a question from the audience that I would like to forward to you. Question from Stefan Lütgenau. Russia's BIP is roughly twice the Swiss gross domestic product and similar to the Italian one. How can Russia afford to run a space program, engage in 2 wars, Donbass and Syria, develop hyper-modern weapon systems, can operate at a global scale, etc.? What are the costs for the Russian citizens? And of course, Mr. KORTUNOV, you have also the opportunity to maybe comment on that, what Alexander and ARMINE said. Mr. KORTUNOV, the floor is yours.
Thank you. What I was trying to say is that the current international situation seems to be conducive to the comparative advantages that the Russian leadership has in making full use of the relative Russian power. Indeed, if you look at the Russian economy, it is not a great economy, and the growth rates are very low right now, partially because of the pandemic, but even before the pandemic we experienced many economic shortcomings. I think that the country needs deep structural reforms, but the leadership is reluctant to embark on this road, primarily because it is concerned about potential political risks associated with such reforms. So the Russian economic policy is very conservative. I wouldn't call it unprofessional. I think that in many ways it is a very professional approach to economy, especially if you take the macroeconomic management. If you take the issues of budget and debt management and containing inflation, I think that Russian authorities basically do many right things, and they do it in a professional way. But indeed, I think that Russia, as I mentioned already, is punching above its weight internationally. And this is because Russia has always been able to mobilize resources better than its adversaries. Let me just give you an example of the Second World War, when Russia had to face consolidated economic power of almost all of Europe, because Germany controlled practically all the European continent, with the exception of the United Kingdom. Of course, the exception of Switzerland, of course, the exception of a couple of other countries, but basically, of course, economically, the Soviet Union had no chance of winning this war. However, the system turned out to be resilient and efficient in terms of resource mobilization. The price is high, because the price that Russia has to pay is relatively low living standards of the Russian population. But if there is one single word in which I would describe the Russian system, this word will be resilience. You know, Russia remains, it has always been and still remains a very resilient country in terms of its ability to absorb shocks and various crises which come in plenty. Now, let me, since I have a chance to comment on what has been said about the Southern Caucasus and Belarus, let me say that my wild guess, and I cannot prove it, but my gut feeling is that we see a change of the Russian attitude towards the so-called near abroad. And if you look at the events of last year, especially, I think that we can conclude that Russia is less interested in a kind of hands-on approach to its neighbors. In Belarus, I do recall a year ago, there were many speculations that Russia would either intervene into Belarus militarily to support Lukashenko, or it would use the relative weakness of Lukashenko in order to accelerate the economic and political integration, trying to absorb Belarus into Russia proper. However, I think what we actually saw was a very cautious and a very, I would even say, timid approach to Belarus. Of course, military intervention was ruled out very fast, but even economically, we can see that the Russian leadership is clearly reluctant to either push Lukashenko harder on the concept of the union state, or to assist him on a larger scale. Lukashenko got another credit line, $1.5 billion, but clearly Russia fell short of his expectations. He wanted to get much more from Moscow, which so far he couldn't. If you take the situation in the Caucasus, again, can you imagine, a couple of years ago, Russia tolerating a NATO member country military presence in its backyard? I think Russia was very slow to react to what's happened in the Caucasus. I think Russia was very benign towards the Turkish presence there. And though Putin can claim victory because of the Russian peacekeepers, but definitely there are more strategic challenges than opportunities that this new situation creates for Russia. If you look at some other situations in the Russian neighborhood, Russia basically almost ignored the turmoil in Kyrgyzstan. It didn't really react to that in any significant way. I would even say that to some extent it ignored the results of the presidential election in Moldova. Again, something which is not particularly usual. So I think the big question is whether we see a turn in the Russian foreign policy, or it is just a tactical adjustment caused by the pandemic and by the economic problems that Russia experiences. My personal conclusion is that it's more than a tactical adjustment. I think that the Russian leadership is gradually learning how to moderate and to manage its ambitions in the near abroad. And I think that probably Russia is now in the mood of trying to assess both assets and liabilities that it has in the former Soviet Union. And the policy is becoming more pragmatic. You can call it cynical if you wish, but definitely it's much more about costs and benefits assessment than it was, let's say, 10 or 20 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. KORTUNOV. You said Russia is pursuing a pragmatic approach. Maybe this can also be a characterization of the relationship between Russia and Turkey. And I'd like to draw the audience attention to this relationship between Moscow and Ankara. There is a so-called cooperative rivalry between these two states. Turkey is also an important player in the Black Sea region, as we all know, and both powers, Turkey and Russia, cooperate and compete in the Black Sea region, but also in the Balkans, in the Middle East, in North Africa. Turkey plays also some role in Ukraine and supports President Zelensky. Mrs. SAHAKYAN, what would you say? as you're also an expert on this region. Where do you see common ground between the great power ambitions of both countries, Russia and Turkey, and where is the potential for conflict?
Thank you. Again, as fairly Mr. KORTUNOV mentioned, whether Russia was slow or reluctant to act fast, now we have a situation where there is a new player in the region. And Russia, as opposed to the past 30 years, where Russia was the only one who managed the escalations, brokered the ceasefires and peace agreements in the region, now they have to agree each and every step they take in regards to this conflict with Turkey. So Turkey's participation largely changed the game and also influenced the outcome of the war. Turkey participated directly as it provided military equipment, the famous Bayraktars, which largely influenced the outcome of the war because they shifted the balance of power in the air. They also participated in the military planning, the training, the management of the troops, so they were present in each and every way they could be in this war. And Turkey and President Erdogan, they also tried to demonstrate their participation. They're not playing low-key. And this was, we can see this in President Erdogan's visit to Baku and then to Shushi, which happened in June, which is a quite demonstrative way of saying that they stand by Azerbaijan and that they are present in the region. Following the war, they also have insignificant military presence in the region, but it also has a potential to grow. They have several dozen militaries in the joint Russian-Turkish monitoring center around the border and also several militaries in Baku. So again, I mentioned that this has the tendency to change in the upcoming 5 years. So as I said, the outcome of the war changed with Turkish participation and inclusion in it. And in the result, in South Caucasus, we have a new situation, a new status quo, which is quite fragile, but still, and the political landscape changed. Russia is not alone anymore to take its decision, and you very fairly describe it as cooperative rivalry, because, again, as I mentioned, to my opinion, for Russia, Turkey is much more understandable both partner and competitor, as opposed to the Western liberal democracies, Europe and United States. They understand much better the way Turkey acts, reacts, takes decisions, fights, or etc. So that is why, yes, they are competitors, but they also cooperate in some sense. So in political sense, South Caucasus is very much like Syria, because Russia, both Azerbaijan's and Turkey's military cooperation has changed the landscape in the South Caucasus, and similar presence Turkey has in the Middle East, as you mentioned, in North Africa. Turkey tries to fuel conflicts in its surrounding neighboring region and tests the grounds and then enters and then is present and has its influence. So we witness the same situation happening in South Caucasus. And during the upcoming 5 years, we will see how the situation changes, because Turkey is here, Turkey is present, and it's not going anywhere.
Thank you. Could you also say some words on Ukraine? What would you say?
Well, again, as I mentioned, President Erdogan tries to pull and test the grounds in its neighboring, Turkey's neighboring region. In every region, he tries to see how far can he go, where are the limits, where he's going to push up either Russia or the NATO partners. So the same is happening in Ukraine, and the same is happening in South Caucasus. It is within the same logic. It's President Erdogan's way of foreign policy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Good, thank you. Alexander, since you're also an expert on Ukraine, how do you see Russia's influence there? We all know that eastern Ukraine and Crimea are one of the hotspots where Russia's great power ambitions clash with the sovereignty claims and the ambitions of another country, in this case of Ukraine. When Ukraine's President Zelensky came to power, he was willing to find a solution together with Moscow. He was more open for sort of compromise than his predecessor. But this failed for the moment. It seems that Russia wasn't really interested in a sort of deal with Ukraine. And a few months ago, there was even the risk of war when Russia concentrated some 100,000 troops close to the border with Ukraine. What is your explanation for these developments in the context of Russia's great power ambitions? And what can be expected from Russia in the context of Ukraine in the near and distant future? Alexander.
Thank you. Vladimir Zelensky was ready for compromises. You're absolutely right. Actually, he was the most conciliatory and, let's call it, Russian-friendly Ukrainian politician. Moscow could have realistically hoped to become president of Ukraine. That's an important point. But nevertheless, over the past few years, Kremlin, along with the Ukrainian Realpolitik, have pushed Zelensky to adopt almost as tough position towards Russia as the position of the former Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko. And I don't think that there are any chances for a dialogue for the next few years, at least till 2024, after a possible re-election of Zelensky. So as for the Russian military buildup along the Ukrainian borders in April 2021, most observers were convinced that the very visible nature of the Russian military buildup meant that it was intended to be seen. And because of that, it was not so much a prelude to a fully fledged invasion, but rather a message of warning towards Ukraine not to cross the red lines. I suppose that Russia was genuinely concerned that Kiev's politicians and leaders could take the words of support from the US administration as backing for an attempt to take back the occupied regions and territories by force, as it was the case back in 2008 in Georgia. And Russia probably feared that the successful military operation and the successful change of the status quo in a frozen conflict, I mean the NagornoKarabakh war back in 2020, might encourage Kiev to initiate military steps. But even though Kiev's moves at that time were obviously not preparations for a military offensive in Donbass, Moscow decided to seize upon them and to raise the stakes. I think the main problem is the potentially dangerous disconnect between the Moscow's perspective of the Donbass conflict and the way this conflict is seen in Ukraine and in the Western countries. So Kremlin's actions are based on certain threat perceptions. And these threat perceptions do not coincide with the Western perceptions. And even more, from the Western point of view, from our point of view, these threat perceptions, Russian threat perceptions, have no real basis. They are just illusions. But nevertheless, Moscow believes that these threats they really exist and justify certain offensive actions. Minsk agreements, just two of short points on Minsk agreements and the situation in Donbass. So the Minsk agreements are still the only basis for the resolution of the Donbas conflict. However, their implementation depends on both international and Ukrainian national preconditions. So the central international precondition would be a cooperation between Washington and Moscow. But from today's perspective, it's quite unlikely, regardless of the recent meeting between Biden and Putin in Geneva. But from Kiev's point of view, the implementation of the Minsk agreements remain also unlikely due to internal Ukrainian political constellations. The political steps that are demanded by Kiev in the Minsk agreements run counter to Ukrainians' national interests. And for this reason, they meet with a very strong resistance within large parts of Ukrainian political elites and are not capable of gaining a majority anytime soon. Finally, it should not be forgotten that both the Minsk Protocol and the Minsk II agreement were the result of Kiev's de facto military defeats. And because of that, the political part of these agreements are not acceptable for Kiev. And furthermore, Moscow insists on a very strict adherence to the points of the agreement and shows itself quite unwilling to accept any softer interpretations of the Minsk agreements that would be necessary for Kiev.
Thank you, Alexander, for this insight on the conflict in eastern Ukraine and your expectations. I would like to invite Mr. KORTUNOV, since he's an insider of Russia's foreign policy, so to say, to comment on this. And I would like to, towards the end of our discussion, I'd like to bring in the question of the relationship between Russia and the European Union and the West in general. Russia is perceived as very confrontational, and in your first statement, Mr. KORTUNOV, you said that due to the comparative advantages that, this won't change much. But what should the West do in order to reach a more positive, great power attitude from Russia? Is there any chance for a change in the behavior of Russia, or should the West change its behavior? What would you say?
Thank you. First of all, on the Ukrainian topic, I think that I would agree with Alexander that indeed we are stuck with the Minsk agreements, and unfortunately it doesn't seem that we can move ahead anytime soon. Basically, if you put yourself into Putin's shoes, you would probably think, why should I go for a more flexible interpretation of the Minsk agreements? What I will get in exchange for my flexibility? And it's clear that he cannot expect a lot of flexibility from the Ukrainian side, because this flexibility will be regarded in Ukraine as a sign of weakness, and that is likely to undermine positions of any political leader who might stay in Kyiv today or tomorrow. So there should be an asymmetrical, there be a deal not between Moscow and Kyiv, but rather between Moscow and the West. I mean, in order to demonstrate this flexibility, Putin has to get something from his Western partners that would allow him to claim that Russia is getting back to Europe. And this is very difficult. This is very difficult because, partially because of the complexity of the European Union and its inability to make difficult decisions. We know that the year of the EU-Russia summit was cancelled recently, and I can add that it is generally very difficult for the European Union to come up with any integrated position on any serious international issue, be it Kosovo independence or attitude towards Venezuela or relations between Israelis and Palestinians. I think on many important issues, unfortunately, the European Union remains a rather loose corporate actor, not a strong consolidated one. Having said that, I should say that, of course, there are some opportunities, at least there are certain avenues for potential progress that we can and probably should explore. Speaking of the Russian position, the position of the Kremlin towards Europe, I think there is one red line which is very clear and which is not going to be negotiated by the Kremlin. And this line is the alleged intention of the European Union to interfere into Russian domestic political processes. If you remember the February trip of Commissioner Josep Borrell to Moscow, which turned out to be a fiasco exactly because the perception that they had in Moscow was that Josep Borrell came to Moscow to teach the Russian leadership how they should treat Navalny, or how they should deal with the political opposition, or how they should cope with human rights problems in Russia. And I'm afraid that this is a non-starter, especially now when the Russian leadership is hypersensitive in view of the forthcoming parliamentary elections in Russia. And of course, this is likely to be a very hard election for the Kremlin. It would be very difficult to win for the ruling party. So I think this is the red line, which is not likely to change. On the other hand, I don't think that the Russian leadership is really interested in any kind of escalation with the European Union. And for example, you know, we had many contacts with the current today, the term of Portugal as the EU president expires, but we had many contacts with our partners in Lisbon, and we assisted in arranging the trip of the Portuguese foreign minister to Moscow. He spoke at our event with the EU delegation. Definitely there are opportunities to start working on specific issues like the European Green Deal or the new generation of information and communication technologies, 5G. We do have some promising cross-border projects between Russia and the EU. I think that the issue of visa liberalization is still with us. Again, you know, I don't want to sound naive or romantic, but definitely if you look for some pockets of cooperation, you'll find them. It will not resolve fundamental disagreements between Brussels and Moscow. These are likely to stay for some time, at least for another couple of years. I think that this relationship is likely to be a mixture of competition and cooperation. But I would strongly recommend more contacts between Brussels and Moscow at various levels, including first track and second track and 1.5 track. I would also suggest that we have more contacts on out-of-area issues like Syria, Libya, maybe Afghanistan, the Iranian nuclear deal, for sure. Here our positions more or less coincide. On the Middle East peace process, I think there are some practical opportunities which are not properly explored by the two sides. Right now, the timing is unfortunate because the European Union has just rejected the idea of a summit meeting. And of course, that implies that Russia is likely to focus more on its contacts with the United States as the sole decision maker in the Western world. And it will also try to focus on its contacts with individual EU member states, which might be more conducive to partnership with Moscow than the Brussels bureaucracy is. So I can imagine Russia getting more active with France, maybe with Germany, depending, of course, on how the elections in Germany end, but also Austria, maybe Hungary, and another couple of usual suspects, which Russia has always tried to court. So it will be difficult, but I think that we shouldn't stay hopeless, and this relationship can be stabilized at a low level for the time being, but gradually we can upgrade it to some extent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. KORTUNOV, for your statement and for pleading for closer contacts between the EU and Russia, and for this quite optimistic perspective. We're coming towards the end of our discussion, but before ending, I'd like to ask my last question to ARMINE. Since you're from Armenia and we had elections there, which ended with a quite surprise, with the victory of Pashinyan. Could you give us an outlook on the perspective for the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and Russia's role? Do you see any change, any chance for change, or will this be a frozen conflict with some other wars maybe in future? What's your perspective?
Well, if we're speaking in the perspective of Armenia's internal politics, I don't think that with the victory of Mr. Pashinyan or Mr. Kocharan or any other person, much things would change as regards to Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, because there is not much thing that Armenia can now do in regards of a favorable outcome for Armenia in this conflict. Everything has been settled during the past year, and now everything depends on Russia's interest in the region. I mean, how long they will keep the peacekeepers in here, that long the people in Nagorno-Karabakh will live in peace at least. So it depends on Moscow, it depends on Ankara, it depends very much on Baku, and very little depends, in my personal opinion, on Yerevan. What Yerevan can do is diplomacy. That's it. And with Mr. Pashinyan or Kocharan, that wouldn't change much, because Armenia is now very much dependent on Russia's foreign policy, Russia's plans for the region, Russia's military presence in the region, etc., etc. As for Armenia's internal politics, we finally have some sort of stability as compared to the past half year, where there were protests on the streets, and there was very much instability and emotional stress, which very much resulted on the foreign policy choices that Mr. Pashinyan made. Well, we'll see how the things will develop for the upcoming 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing in your perspective. Many thanks to all 3 speakers, to you, Mrs. Sahakyan from Yerevan. Thank you to Mr. KORTUNOV for his insights, to Moscow, and thank you, Alexander, for your analysis and the good cooperation. Thank you to those who followed us on YouTube and Facebook. As I said, the video will be available also after the event on both platforms. And feel free to to watch the video again or invite others to do so. Of course, Russia and Eastern Europe in general will remain in our focus. So there will be, of course, other events in autumn or next year. And before ending, I'd like to draw your attention to two events of the Karl-Renner-Institut before the summer break. Next Tuesday, we will have an event on the parliamentary elections in Bulgaria with Atanas Bekhanov, who is Vice Prime Minister in Bulgaria. We are very glad that he confirmed his participation in this event next Tuesday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And on a very different topic, we will have an event with EU Commissioner Elena Dalli on the EU strategies against the backlash on women's rights triggered by the COVID-19 crisis. So a very important topic too. I'd like to invite you to attend these events, online events, next week, and with Commissioner Dalli, the event is on July 13. So again, many thanks to the speakers and to the audience, and see you soon on other events of our institute. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.